Emily, you're going sideways from,
No
you're
problem.
like
Lost the tech pants.
falling off your couch.
I can solve it. Holes in the tarp. That's easy to fix. Oh, but run out of coffee.
Hey, Esther and Steve.
It's the end of the trip.
Oh, there I am.
There you
Gotta
are. Now we
have
can
my
hear you.
hands
Barely. Your
around the
mic's
mud.
turned down pretty low, I think,
Watching
but
the
that's
mist
maybe
rise
a
with
little
the
bit.
first hot sip.
All right, I think we're
Yeah,
gonna get
yeah.
started
Let
here.
me just say a quick hello to everybody.
Yeah,
Sort of, I don't have anything prepared, so it's just going to be off the cuff. Welcome remarks to everybody. I see a lot of familiar faces, people that are already members of Paddle Trails Canoe Club. This is sort of a um, Paddle Trails Canoe Club um, event, if you will, or talk, loosely affiliated with Paddle Trails. We open it up to anybody who follows the Paddle Trails Canoeing the Pacific Northwest Facebook group. Um, but would love it if you're interested in talks like this and hearing more, maybe joining Paddle Trails. We're been around since 1970. I think it's about 50 years ago that Paddle Trails was formed. I've been a member since the early 1980s. A lot of the folks that are on this call I know are also long time members, and are, we love to engage with other canoeists out there, even if you're not a member. But would especially love it if you wanted to join. It's only $25 a year for a membership, and that membership includes anybody in your household. Um, so if you have kids, certainly love to have you join. We're very family friendly, um, and again, we're really trying to engage with all types of canoeists out there in the Pacific Northwest. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jesse.
awesome. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you.
So let's get started. This is the first edition of Paddle Tales, and I just wanted to say welcome. I'm Jesse Swedlund. I'm one of the training co-chairs of Paddle Trails, and Paddle Trails is the canoeing club of the Seattle area. And like Dave said, we just had our 50th anniversary as a club, so that's very exciting. And as COVID continues to sort of interrupt our normal club activities, the board wanted to think of ways that as a community we could come together and for the club to offer value while we can't run trips. And so we had this idea for a monthly paddling presentation, and thus Paddle Tales was born. And so our vision is that this will become kind of like a monthly series where folks can share their experiences and knowledge of world-class paddling locations and trips, as well as other paddling topics. So if you think you have something good to share and some good content and pictures and videos and stuff like that, send us a message at training@paddletrails.org. That's training@paddletrails.org. We'd love to have some more people present. So, few housekeeping items. Let's observe good Zoom etiquette. So keep yourself muted during the presentation. We will have a opportunity for question and answer at the end where you can unmute and ask some questions. And if the internet starts to kind of get laggy on us, we may ask that everyone turns their cameras off, just so we can have like more bandwidth for the presentation to come through cleanly. For now, it seems good. Also, just a Zoom thing, you can kind of change your view of the people that you're seeing versus the presentation. In the upper right hand corner there should be a view button, and you can change that to gallery view, or there's some different kind of standard view stuff like that. So if you're wondering how to see more people, that's how you do that. Cool. And yeah, like Dave said, we decided to advertise to a bunch of different groups. So if you are in the Pacific Northwest and you've been on the Facebook group and you're not a Paddle Trails member, we highly encourage you to join. It's only $25 a year and it's a pretty cool club. So let's get started here. So I took this photo on the shore of American Point overlooking Saginaw Lake. It's about halfway through the Boundary Waters portion of a 72-day outward bound semester trip. And not so coincidentally, about a month After about a month on the US-Canadian border, the second half of the trip was on the southern border in Big Bend National Park on the Rio Grande with my trusty co-instructor, Ollie Williams, who will be heading up the second half of this presentation. So Ollie and I were both outward bound instructors, and that's where we ran a lot of our trips in the Boundary Waters. And there's also a base down in the Big Bend area in Texas. Ellie, who's with us, is also an alum of Voyager Outward Bound School and also ran trips down in Texas. And yeah, Outward Bound is a kind of an expeditionary school that focuses on character development and leadership. Maybe you've heard of Knowles. It's kind of similar to that. We do trips and with a big focus on character development. I took this photo of Ollie kind of with our students there. This is actually a little preview. It's down in Texas, but it just kind of shows you a little bit about that kind of instructor-student relationship. So let's talk about the Boundary Waters. So what is the BWCAW as it's known? Well, it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Geographically speaking, it's in the northeast tip of Minnesota on the Canadian border there. So we'll zoom in a little bit here and zoom in again. And it's this green area here, if you can see my cursor, that's right on the border. So that's the Boundary Waters. It's situated in the Superior National Forest up there. And it's basically a huge body of chain lakes on the US-Canadian border. And it's a really beautiful area. This kind of shows you this view, all of the different lakes and rivers that are in that area. And you can see the Quetico, which is kind of the Canadian side of the Boundary Waters, just kind of continues up there with all these different lakes. And it's a really incredible area. I've never been anywhere like it, where you can just, you can go on literally a 200-mile long canoe trip and never have to, if you're getting out of your canoe, it's because you're portaging it or you're camping for the night. So it's a pretty amazing area. Some facts about the Boundary Waters. There's over 1,100 lakes and hundreds of miles of rivers and streams. It's over 1 million acres of protected wilderness. There's over 2,000 backcountry campsites and over 1,200 miles of canoe routes. And really, you could loop around and kind of endlessly, the possibilities are totally endless there. So a little bit about the geography. It was the Boundary Waters, along with the Great Lakes, were formed by the Laurentide ice sheet. And this was the last ice age. That ice sheet kind of came down, that glacier, and as it receded, it left scars in the land that filled up with water that melted from the glacier, and that became all of these wonderful lakes and rivers in the area that we now know as the Boundary Waters. There's also some really cool history there. One of the really cool things you can find in the Boundary Waters are pictographs. These were left behind by the Cree and Ojibwe people. And there's a few different locations where they're pretty prominent. And so historically speaking, this area was home to the Cree and Ojibwe tribes, and they navigated and knew the waterways and portages of the region via birch bark canoe, the way that you might drive the streets of your hometown and know the different ways around. And they were excellent canoeists, hunters, and trappers. And unfortunately, like much of the United States, the land that makes up the Boundary Waters was kind of taken from these native tribes by European American settler colonists and various governments through broken treaties. And prior to the dispossession of their land, because of their expertise in trapping beaver, these tribes formed a very lucrative partnership with the French fur traders known as the Voyageurs. And so the Voyageurs were kind of known to be tough, short men who brought the prized beaver pelt from deep into the interior to the shores of Lake Superior via the Voyager Highway, which is the kind of the giant lakes that are now on the present day border and don't have many portages. So you can just paddle for, 20 miles before you have to portage. And then that ends with the Grand Portage, which is an 8-mile portage that connects the interior lakes with Lake Superior. And from Lake Superior, those goods would then make their way to Europe. So naturally speaking, the BWCAW is nestled into an incredible Northwoods forest. It's home to many different flora and fauna, and one of my favorite sounds to wake up to is the song of the loon. I'm just gonna play that for you here. Here's a little loon song for you. So the loon is the Minnesota state bird, and it's a pretty cool bird. It can stay underwater for long periods of time, eats fish, and really makes those beautiful calls. There's a lot of different types of birds in the Boundary Waters. There's swans. I took this photo actually on Rose Lake, and these swans, it was actually the first time I'd seen swans in the Boundary Waters. Pretty sweet. There's also bald eagles, tons of bald eagles in the Boundary Waters. Great spot to see eagles. Lots of little furry critters too, like chipmunks, squirrels, and mice. So the little guys. And then there's also the big guys, moose. And I did take this picture, but I didn't take this one. I got this one off of Google. So I have seen quite a few moose in the Boundary Waters. I think I've had maybe 5 or 6 moose sightings, and none of them were quite this close. Maybe one of them was actually. I actually saw a moose and its baby kind of out in the water, probably like 20 feet away. And then there's also black bears. And I've got actually a few bear and camp stories from the Boundary Waters, but probably the eeriest time was we got back to camp one time after a day paddle, and we just saw the butt of the bear leaving camp as we came in. It kind of got scared when heard the noises, but we knew it was around, so we decided to build a giant bear trap, we called it. Not really a trap, but around our food. We typically take 7 75-pound food packs on these 3-week trips, and so there's no way we can hang all the food. And so we put 2 canoes over the food and set it up with a bunch of paddles and pots on top so it would make an alarm in case the bear came around. It did not set off our bear alarm, but in the morning when we woke up, one of the PFDs that was laying next to the tent, just about a foot away from the tent, had a giant paw print on it from a bear. So the bear was literally like a foot away from someone's head. So we do share this area with the bears, but they're pretty harmless. They just want your food, so you just got to be careful about where you keep your food. Not in the tent is the big clue there. There's also one type of animal in the Boundary Waters that we haven't talked about yet that the Boundary Waters is totally famous for, and that is fish. This is a picture of me with probably one of the best fish I've ever caught. Just beautiful northern pike. And oh, whoa, who's putting all these pictures of me with catching tons of fish? Whoa, this is crazy. Who did that? Whoa. Anyway, so personally speaking, the Boundary Waters was my home for 4 summers, and it's really a place of beauty and peace, where you can really get away from it all and experience nature. And it's really just a really wonderful place. And I don't know if you've seen the picture right behind me, if you can see my camera, but this is actually that picture. We have it framed in my bedroom. These are just a few pictures that, and I did take most of these pictures out on our trips. I would bring a nice camera with me in a waterproof box and take it out on occasion. And it's a place where you can unplug and connect with people in a way that's very hard to do in everyday life. And this is actually a picture of a couple of our students from the semester course at the fire grate there one night. And it's a place I've strengthened a lot of my personal relationships. This is a picture of my dad and I on a trip, right at the beginning of a trip. Picture of my mom and I on a trip we went on. I also took my brother out there, and that's my partner Haley, and we went on a trip as well. That's a handmade crossword puzzle I made for her. So it's just a really awesome place. It's also a place I've taken a lot of students and young people out there. This is a really cool little waterfall that's on the side of one of the portages that we decided to swim in. Here's a picture of one of my crews. So let's get back to the semester trip. The course was advertised as a border-to-border trip. As much of the time we were paddling on the Canadian border, and then we went down south onto the Mexican border. And our story begins here in Ely, Minnesota. And I don't know if you can see this, but here is the outward bound base. We call it home place. So it's just outside of Ely, about 20 minutes away. And you can't see it here, but this river actually continues on right to the outward bound base, and the base is right on the edge of that river. So you can paddle right out of the boundary waters to the base. So Ely, Minnesota, it is one of the gateways of the boundary waters. It's kind of a rustic town, kind of filled with outfitters and mom and pop shops. It feels a little more like a northern Minnesota town, a little less frills. The other gateway to the boundary waters is Grand Marais. And Grand Marais is a little more touristy, kind of like feels a little, it's right on the shore of Lake Superior, feels a little more, I don't know, high class, but and it's also really cool. Nothing against it, but I'm more of an Ely guy. So this is a picture of home place. This is the outward bound base, right on the edge of Birch Bay there. And that's a kind of our main big building. And we've also got this kayak shed. We've got tons of canoes on base too. And there are some whitewater canoes as well. And as well as all these whitewater kayaks. And this is kind of where I first learned whitewater, was kind of in these kayaks and in the whitewater canoes that we have there right on base. And just behind this shed is the river. So it's a pretty awesome little place. Food packing, this is in our trips building, and this is where we typically bring like 7 75-pound food packs on a 3-week trip. And this is a picture of actually me on right before my very first travel with all the other first-year instructors packing our food. So back to the semester trip. This is a couple of students laying out the maps to see, to plan the route for kind of the last push, the last kind of week. So our put in was on Crane Lake, this red dot here, if you can see my cursor. It's on the left side of the screen. And Crane Lake is actually the westernmost access point for the boundary waters. And as a side note, you do need permits for the boundary waters. So if you're thinking about going, there's a limited amount of permits for each day in each location. So you kind of do have to plan where you want to go and make sure you get that permit for the correct day. And to access the western boundary waters here, you normally take the Echo Trail out of Ely, which is this, it becomes a gravel road and it kind of goes along the western boundary waters, and it accesses all these different lakes here. And then if you're looking to go into the central boundary waters, there's the Fernberg Trail, which goes east out of Ely, and it gets to a lot of these middle lakes like Basswood and Moose and Snowbank. And then if you're going to go out of Grand Marais, totally on the right side here, you take the Gunflint Trail, which takes you up to these lakes out in the eastern boundary waters. And some of these lakes are really some of my favorite lakes in the boundary waters. We actually don't get out there much. A lot of our courses for outward bound happen in this area, and it's seldom do we go this way. But the really cool part about this border to border trip is that because we were following the Voyager Highway, we were pretty much on the border the entire time, following these really big, beautiful lakes. And we went from the entire west side of the boundary waters to fully the east side, ending at the Grand Portage. And I think somewhere around after American Point up here, we did kind of dip down and do some portaging to get to our solo lake. And I'll talk about solo later, but yeah, we also knew that we had the Grand Portage coming up, which is an 8-mile portage. So we had to get into portaging shape and not just paddle the whole time. Plus outward bound courses are supposed to be hard. So we've got to do some hard portaging. So this is our classic day one photo of the trip. And you might notice Ollie is not in this photo, and that's because he only was the instructor for the second half of the trip down in Texas. And I met him down there with the crew after the first half. We began the trip in mid-September. I think September is one of the best times to be in the Boundary Waters. There's no bugs, beautiful fall colors, and really nice temperatures most of the time. It's kind of that hybrid fall-summer feel, and the bugs can really be bad in the Boundary Waters. So it's the fall is really a nice time. We were greeted with this Hangman's Island. This is just outside of the Boundary Waters, actually, and I think it's someone's private little island that they made that warns people, all ye who enter, watch out. But actually, you don't have to watch out, because it's really just gorgeous. So this is a picture of one of the really big lakes, Lac La Croix, and you can just see, there's a lot of these are actually islands. These shores are layers of islands that are behind each other, and isn't even the other side of the lake. You can't even see it because there's so many different islands around. So this is a really beautiful lake. One of the other cool things about the Boundary Waters is every single campsite has a fire grate that you can cook on top of, and so you can bring stoves, but it's pretty cool to cook over a fire every night, and so we would do that. And you can also throw your fish right on the grate as well if you want, with some tin foil. Just make sure you leave no trace and pack that tin foil out. And the other great things about the campsites is that they all have a latrine as well, and so you don't have to dig a hole every time. You can get to camp and use those latrines, which is really nice. Also, I took this photo. It's not one of my best photos, but it kind of just shows the breadth of stars that you can see when you're out in the Boundary Waters at night. It's a pretty dark place, so that's another big draw. And also, you usually have a pretty good view from your campsite. So this is sunrise from one of our campsites, and it's a pretty cool way to start the morning. So we proceeded from west to east, and this is Curtain Falls. And Curtain Falls is the big waterfall, and it's actually it's bigger than it looks in this photo. But you would never want to run that thing. It's huge, and probably class 6 or unrunnable. But it's a really cool spot. The mist is kind of coming off of the falls, and this is between Iron Lake and Crooked Lake, and Crooked Lake is kind of the next big long lake after Lac La Croix, and Iron Lake is sort of in between. Kind of a cool spot. These are some of the pictographs that we saw. You can see here looks like a moose, and then here's a canoe and a bird, pelican or something like that. So this is on Crooked Lake. But it's not all fun and games. There is a lot of portaging to do in between lakes, and portaging is can be tough. It hurts sometimes. You got to put your canoe on the shoulders and carry those heavy packs across. A lot of times we take 2 trips to get everything across, and a lot of people will talk about the Boundary Waters and be like, oh, how many portages did you do? How many rods was it? Rods are how the portages are measured, and a rod is actually 1 canoe length, which is typically about 16.5 feet. So this is Crooked Lake here. So right here on the left side, that's where Curtain Falls is, where that first picture was. And these bays are actually all named. They're called the day bays. You've got Sunday Bay, Saturday Bay, Friday Bay, Thursday Bay, Wednesday Bay. And our students had the bright idea that we were here, and I think this is Thursday Bay, and we were camped here on the shore. And it was their first day where they were in a little bit more control of the expedition. We kind of like we have different phases of the expedition where we're training them, and then they're kind of like, they get more responsibility and freedom as they prove that they're worthy and that they've learned. And so they decided with their first day of freedom that instead of paddling the 12 miles around the Horn here, that they were going to paddle down to this lake and crash through the woods and cut off all that paddling. Well, crashing or portaging where there's no trail can actually take a really long time and be a huge pain, and they found that out. So here's kind of a picture of them starting that process as they got to the end, as the creek kind of dried up and became too rocky to navigate, and they had to crash the rest of it, and actually took pretty much all day to get through that. And they learned pretty quickly, yeah, we should probably stick to portage trails and not do as much crashing. And here's another, you can kind of see the looks on their faces. They don't look too amused at this point. But we got through that, and this is a picture of 3 of the guys kind of jumping off into the bay here. And in the background is actually Basswood Falls. And Basswood Falls is, this is kind of the beginning of the Basswood River. And the Basswood River is actually one of the few places where there's some class 3 whitewater in the Boundary Waters. It's only about, I think, maybe a mile long, but there are maybe 4 or 5 good rapids there. It is pretty deep in the Boundary Waters, so if you're going in there just for the whitewater, it's a nice haul. But if you had this campsite where we were at, it'd be kind of a nice place to play in some of that whitewater. So here's another picture of some of the nice fall colors there. And this is actually in a bit of a burn area. You can see that some of these trees had burned, and so you've got kind of a nice regrowth happening here with some really good colors. This is at the Canadian border. This is after the Prairie Portage, and it has this nice Welcome to Canada sign. So crews like to take pictures by that. And then we had to crash into our solo site. So there was another crash that had to happen. And there's lakes that are called primitive management areas, or PMAs. And you have to have a special permit to go to a PMA, and that's where we go for solo. And solo is where everyone goes and sets up a tarp and ends up camping for about 2 to 3 nights alone. And it's a time of reflection and some journaling, and some good breakthroughs sometimes happen on those solos. And it's also kind of a break from the expedition. But to get to those lakes, they have no portage trails, so you have to crash through. So this is quite the crash to get to our solo lake.
Hey Jesse, do you have time for a question?
Let's save them till the end.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
But yeah, we could do some brief questions if we want to take a couple questions before Ollie's section, but then we'll have like a longer Q&A for the end. So this is one of the solo spots here, and kind of shows like his tarp that he had set up in his little spot, and all the students had that. So after solo, we did some tea rescue training, where we had taught them how to rescue each other out there. And this was all going to be important because it was leading into eventually the whitewater that we would do down on the Rio Grande. So now we're kind of getting towards the end of the trip, and I took this photo. Here's the swans again, with this really nice bluff in the background, and those aspen trees just kind of lighting up the hillside. This is Rose Lake. I think Rose Lake is one of my favorite lakes in the Boundary Waters. Really beautiful. Another kind of view of it. There's our students out front leading the way. And another cool part about the Eastern Boundary Waters is you have these long lakes, and you can actually do some sailing. So we lashed our 4 canoes together, and this is our brigade tarp that we would set up every night to put all the equipment under. And we lashed it to some paddles, and we had the wind. We had a good tailwind, and we actually cruised down the lake at a pretty good clip. So here's actually a video of that kind of shows you just how fast we were actually sailing.
land really shows how fast we're moving.
And you can see our boats are producing a wake there. We're really moving. So that's a pretty cool thing that we get to do sometimes out there with students, and on these trips where you have 4 canoes. It's pretty cool. So between Rose Lake, that lake I was just talking about, here's that bluff that we were looking at before, and Rove Lake, there's the Long Portage. And Long Portage, it's also called the Baby Grand because it is a 2-mile portage. And so the Baby Grand kind of gets you into portaging shape before you do the Grand Portage. So we continued along the border and we got to the Pigeon River. And the Pigeon River is a pretty shallow, rocky river. And actually we had to line a lot of it because we couldn't paddle it. It was too shallow. And so here's our students doing some lining and getting down that river. And that river leads to the site of Fort Charlotte here. And this is the Grand Portage, the 8 to 8.5 mile portage that ends at the Heritage Center, which is the old rendezvous place. And that's where the French fur traders and natives and the Montreal men who would take all of the furs from here to Montreal, where they'd get shipped, get put on ships to go over to Europe, would meet here at the end of the Grand Portage. So this is a pretty historic spot. And it was really cool to actually do it. And we ended up doing it in parcels. We got to Fort Charlotte the night prior, and we portaged the boats halfway, and we left them. We went back, we made dinner, we set up camp, and I think we had actually set up camp beforehand, and we got a good night's sleep. And then we portaged all of the gear to the boats. And at that point, we had eaten enough of our food that we only had 1 food pack left. So we had the perfect amount of packs and boats to then, once we got halfway to our boats, we were able to kind of piece it out. And we were done actually with the Grand Portage the next day by like, I think 1 or 2 p.m. It was not as bad as we thought it would be, but it was definitely an undertaking. And the whole expedition prepared us for it. So here's us at the beginning of the Grand Portage, and you can see Fur Trade Headquarters 8.5 miles away. This is about the halfway mark. It does cross a road at one point. It's got kind of some signage to tell people about it. And then here's us at the end of the Grand Portage. And at the end there is this Heritage Center that was open that we went into, and it kind of has a bunch of furs and memorabilia from the area. This is one of our students kind of acting funny about one of the furs. Poor fox, poor little fox. And it ends on Lake Superior. So this was the end of the trip here. And this was our view, one of our last views in Minnesota before we got on a plane and flew to El Paso, where we met this guy. And Ollie's going to take it from here. But if we have any questions, quick questions about the Boundary Waters portion, I can take a couple questions before we hand it over to Ollie.
Yeah, mine's quick. So what are the, I guess, when you're paddling along the border, what are the border issues? I mean, are you, as US citizens, do you have to have, is there any kind of like weird immigration things? Can you actually camp in Canada? I know there's stories of some Canadians that landed somewhere up in Alaska, and they had to like go to jail for just getting out of their canoes without going through immigration. It was like completely weird. I know there's some arcane regulations. So what were the issues with paddling along?
Yeah, so you do need to stay on the American side. There actually are kind of some Mounties in motorboats who can come get you if they see you come across. So there are some portages though that are kind of known to be that Americans can use, even though they're on the Canadian side. There's a couple little rivers that have some rapids and stuff like that where the Canadian side is just a better spot to do it. And it's kind of by courtesy, you're allowed to use the Canadian side as long as you get back to the American side quickly.
Okay,
and don't dawdle. So I'm going to pass it over to Ollie now. If you have any other questions, save them to the end. And I'm just going to make Ollie host here real quick. Let's see. And then he can start sharing his screen.
Great, thanks, Jesse. Let's see if I can make this thing work. So as Jesse mentioned, my name is Ollie Williams. I'm also one of the Paddle Trails training co-chairs. Thanks, Jesse, for that dirty, grizzled photo you showed at the end there. I really needed a haircut that day, apparently. Don't worry, a little bit of payback's coming. And I'm also going to share a little bit about this this amazing paddling location, the Rio Grande and the Big Bend section in Texas, on the Texas-Mexico border. And I'm going to share it through the lens a little bit of Jesse and my trip down there. And I'm going to show a lot of photos. Most of them were taken by Jesse, some of the really good ones. I've also got a few photos from some other trips that I went on, and a couple that I also pulled off the internet just to kind of show things that I couldn't quite find. And I'll just share that as I was starting to prepare for this presentation, I certainly found it hard to parse it down. That you know, the Rio Grande on a whole has such a rich history, you know, cultural uses, you know, implications for the border, environmental implications that we could talk for hours about that. And also the Rio Grande, the Big Bend area in Texas and Mexico also has such a rich history, and there's so much to do and see down there. We could talk for hours about that, but I'm going to focus in on the river section of the Big Bend, and I'll show you what I mean by that. If I can get this to move, whoops. Bear with me. All right, so just a little bit on the Rio Grande in general. It does start in Colorado and work its way through New Mexico. As it does go through New Mexico, it gets dammed many times. It gets dammed and diverted and used for a variety of things, such that by the time it gets to El Paso, it's somewhat of a trickle. There is some world-class whitewater in New Mexico. The Taos Box may ring a bell for some people, but really all that beautiful water is used up by the time it gets to Texas. And if you can see my cursor, really this whole section from El Paso down to the Big Bend area, this kind of Big Bend, as we say, this really isn't paddleable for the most part. It's such a trickle that it's not really worth doing. You know, there are a few source to sea expeditions that have traversed the whole river, and people kind of need to either walk or ride their bikes or drag their boats through this section. It's most typically hiked or their bikes are ridden. But down at the start of the Big Bend area, a river comes in from Chihuahua called the Rio Conchos that provides most of the flow for the Big Bend area. In the summer months, it's the rainy season and it fills a dam. And then throughout the fall and winter, water is released into the Rio Grande. So really that's the time to paddle. It would be fall for the most part, fall and winter, this upper section at least. And on the lower section of the Big Bend area, it's actually fed by springs. So it kind of changes the character of the river. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. One final fact on the river as a whole is that it, as of the early 2000s, more or less, it only intermittently reaches the Gulf of Mexico. It's a consequence of climate change is that it gets used up. The flow is decreased such that it just peters out close to the Gulf, which is kind of a sad thing. Here's a zoomed in map of the area I'm going to be talking about. This is the Big Bend, again, as we say. And really there's three sections to it. One we call the Upper Canyons, which starts kind of near Presidio, where our outward bound base was, and goes to just past Lajitas right here at the beginning of Big Bend National Park. This is a section I've done several times. I know very well. I spend a lot of my time there. The middle section is called the Great Unknown. I'll tell you a little bit more why it's called that later, but I've only paddled that once. And this final section is called the Lower Canyons. I paddled that twice. So most of my knowledge is on the first section, but I'll share what I know about the rest of it as well. One last map I'd like to share kind of shows the parks in the area. Big Bend National Park is pretty iconic, and you've probably heard of it. Big Bend Ranch State Park is a undervalued state park, in my opinion. It's also right next to Big Bend National Park. There's another wildlife management area and also two pretty massive parks on the Mexican side. So there's a lot of conserved land in this area, which is which is a really great thing because this is a pretty precious resource down here. Just a little bit on Outward Bound down here. This is the Outward Bound base camp in this little tiny town of Redford, Texas. There's about 100 people or so live in this town. The river, the border is about maybe a half mile or so past that building, our base camp. So you're looking into Mexico off in the distance. Really beautiful shot right there. And this is looking the other direction towards the north into Big Bend Ranch State Park. Another amazing view. Really, wherever you look down in this area, it's pretty jaw-dropping in a lot of ways. A couple of those peaks I've had the opportunity to hike to the top of, and it's pretty breathtaking, a lot of those views. Here's just a couple shots of the inside of the base. These big salsa containers are balers. You'll notice some throw bags, other ropes, PFDs, sleeping bags. This was kind of midway through it was getting put together. The gear side of things. And here's a shot of Jesse and I packing our food for the trip ahead as well. Kind of a fun little project. It takes a lot of time to pack food for several weeks. We were on the river for total about 2 weeks down in Texas, but we also did some backpacking, and so there's some food packed for that as well. Here's a shot out back behind the base camp. These are the canoes we had our first year. You'll see, those of you who are familiar with canoes, will see a bunch of Old Town trippers. That was primarily what we used, tandem boats, a few solo boats sprinkled in there, and a rickety old shade structure to keep the UV light from damaging. In the following year, we actually expanded our fleet. Those are some boats, kind of hard to tell because they're upside down, but those are Esquif Canyons and Prospectors. So we kind of upgraded our fleet a little bit to some more sporty boats that were a little more fun to paddle. You'll also notice in the background of this photo some snow on the peaks in the distance. That's over in Mexico. It's a desert, so it's generally extremely hot, but every once in a while you get some of that special desert snow. So the first section that I'm going to be talking about is the upper canyons. I'm going to scroll through some photos of that. Here's a photo of me in the solo boat, just kind of playing around. But take a look at these photos as I kind of give you the general character of the upper canyons. Jesse and I took about a week to paddle this section. It's about 40 miles long for the most part, and it's generally mostly class 2, a little bit approaching class 3 whitewater, lots of pool drop rapids. It's got the most dense whitewater of any section that I'm going to talk about. Here's a great action shot that Jesse took of me doing a low brace. Beautiful background, and really that photo kind of seems to kind of be really alive. You can see the action happening there. I really like that photo. You know, a lot of commercial outfitters use this section. I don't know if you remember the map I showed. There's a road that parallels it for a lot of it. So there's tons of put-ins and takeouts, and so commercial outfitters will use rafts and duckies and go out for a day trip or a few nights in this section. So it is close to a road, but it still is pretty remote feeling. Very few cars drive on that road, and it's often obscured from view. So Jesse had done some canoeing training with our students up in Minnesota. They'd gotten a lot of flat water experience, but this was their first time on whitewater. And Outward Bound regularly takes totally novice paddlers on this section of water. So it can't be that hard, right? I mean, it's not technically challenging in a lot of ways, but there are a lot of unique hazards, especially for first-time paddlers. Like most desert rivers, there's the classic flash flood hazard. Debris can come down, even garbage sometimes. Some of the downsides of this river is that there is agricultural runoff, runoff from towns and cities as well when the water rises. You're bringing all of your drinking water because it isn't technically safe to drink. There's also kind of a hazard called river cane, which is this plant that overhangs the banks, and the river often winds past it, and it can act as a sweeper and knock you out of your boat, which has happened on several occasions. So it's definitely certainly something to watch out for. And there are, of course, desert environmental hazards, sun, heat, things that bite and sting. So it can be a pretty dangerous place at times. Here's a photo of some of our Outward Bound friends playing around in a Esquif Canyon at the end of a long travel day. You'll notice that it's empty right now. Something we do pretty often on Jesse and my trip and on other trips in general, is to empty our boats at the end of the day and go out and play around. They're actually surfing in a hole right there. A couple other action shots coming down a rapid at the end of the day. Take a look at this photo and notice the kind of the different color of the water there. That chocolate milk kind of color indicates the water is rising, and it's rising quickly. That's one of the signals that flash flood is either happening or on its way. And they don't happen as you maybe see them in movies where a big wall of water comes, but the water rises quickly. And it can be a real hazard, especially depending on where you're camped. Stay tuned for a quick story on that coming up later. Here's kind of another glamour shot of me in a solo boat. You'll notice that behind me, there's a bucket with a red lid on it. The price I had to pay to paddle that solo boat that day was to carry the human waste for the day. So like most desert rivers, you're packing out your human waste. I was willing to pay that price to get to paddle the Outrage X. Here's a shot of a typical campsite in the Upper Canyons. Really beautiful, comfortable campsites, flat, sandy, often in a canyon, so you're a little bit sheltered from the sun. And just amazing sunsets pretty much every night. This is a shot Jesse took that has some really beautiful colors. Took this shot from that campsite in the last photo. And much like Boundary Waters, pretty much glorious stars and moons if you got them. More so than Minnesota, the sky is pretty much clear almost every night. It does rain, it does storm, but the stars, the constellations are something you can pretty much always rely on for the most part. And one of my favorite activities was to pick out the constellations. The Upper Canyons ends at this scene. You're kind of paddling along through some winding passages, and you kind of see this massive rock formation in front of you. Now, you can't see it, but the river kind of traverses from right to left, flows from right to left in front of this big kind of rock face, and then bends around to the right where that shadow is being cast. And this is the opening to Santa Elena Canyon, which is really the highlight of this section and also the technical crux. Most groups camp at this site before they go in the next day. This is called entrance camp. It's a beautiful campsite, massive, tons of flat spots. There's actually frequently wild horses nearby. If you can see those down in the corner. There's some shots Jesse took, some wild horses close up there. It also provides an opportunity to go for a quick hike. This was a hike we took from entrance camp up to the rim of the canyon, and it's a spot you get to look down into the canyon and see what you're going to paddle the next day. It's a little bit intimidating to look over the canyon rim and to picture yourself going into this chasm, but it's a totally unique view, one that's certainly worth doing if you ever find yourself at entrance camp. Here's a view from that day hike looking off into Mexico. That's a formation called the Sentinel. It's a landmark we use to keep our eye on and know that we're approaching Santa Elena Canyon. We're entering the depths. And the following day when you paddle, you're rewarded with views like this. It's truly an otherworldly place to paddle. I know that there's tons of canyons out there, and I don't have a lot of experience in desert paddling, but this one, I mean, Santa Elena's canyon walls rise 1,500 feet, pretty sheer limestone, almost totally flush and just massive relief. It's almost like you're trapped in some ways, and in other ways you are. Really spectacular spot. This is a really horrible photo, I know, but it does it's the only photo I could find to show from above the Crux Rapid. This is called Rock Slide. I'll just pause here for a moment as you can kind of see the hazards associated with this. It's not a terribly challenging rapid in a lot of ways, but one of the reasons it's really difficult is because the portage in the Scout looks like this. You've got to do some kind of rock scrambling to get a good look at it and to portage it if you don't think you're gonna paddle it. American Whitewater rates this rapid up to class 4, and the reasons why are because, one, it's so remote. You're in this canyon wall where rescue is virtually impossible. Once you enter Santa Elena Canyon, there's pretty much only one way out, and it's downstream. And also the reasons I just mentioned, it's really difficult to see the hazards that are coming in front of you, and it's really difficult to portage or scout. One of our outward bound policies was to call in before we enter using our satellite phone before we enter the canyon, to check the CFS and to check the weather forecast, because at a certain point, it does become very dangerous, becomes very boily, and things can get out of hand quickly. So definitely a place to exercise caution, but a really amazing paddling experience just for the technical paddling and the scenery and the challenge. It's so unique. A couple last shots of people paddling out of the Rock Slide Rapid. I'll share a couple other highlights of being in Santa Elena Canyon. It's only about maybe 5 miles long or so, and Rock Slide is in the first mile or so. So there's some easy paddling afterwards. You see a lot of shots like this. There's some of the river cane I was talking about on the sides of the river. Really beautiful images in the canyon. There's a couple spots you can camp in the canyon, which is a pretty magical experience. You do need to be careful because you're kind of bound by these sheer walls. And so if the river does rise, you might find yourself in a jam. But exercising some caution and finding a way to get away from the river, you might find it yourself at a place like this. This is one of my favorite shots that Jesse took from our trip. This is at a campsite in Santa Elena, and the light from the fire bouncing off the canyon walls and just that sliver of night sky and those crystal clear stars. It's a campsite unlike any other. One other highlight of Santa Elena Canyon is a spot called Fern Canyon that enters Santa Elena Canyon. If you can make your way past this knee, thigh deep mud, you'll find crystal clear pools like this. We made a little game out of it, trying to do some rock climbing, some bouldering around them. There's a couple spots to do that in this canyon. There's one spot that we've called the Humbler, because for most people, you are humbled by it. Go for a drink. But it's a really fun activity. And just as quickly as Santa Elena rose in front of you, it falls away. This is the exit of Santa Elena Canyon, and you kind of leave it out into this big flat expanse. And this is kind of more or less the start of the area called the Great Unknown. I think it's called that because it's not paddled very often. It's not as sexy as the upper and lower canyons. It's got kind of big, expansive views, kind of like this. There's lots of flat water, a lot of class 1, some class 2, but really easy paddling, pretty mellow. It's about 80 miles in total, and Jesse and I did it in about a week. We were aided by a river rise. Oh, there's also this photo. Don't remember to put sunscreen on. Easy to forget that. It's kind of a goofy, weird photo. Back to the Great Unknown. Really big, expansive views, as I was saying. Leads you to have a lot of time on your hands to kind of get silly. Look what Jesse found. I don't know for sure if this is dangerous or not. I guess I can't recommend it, but nobody got hurt, so don't do as Jesse does. And there's another weird photo of me. Jesse told me I had to put this in, so I put it in, and we're moving on. Here's one photo of our canoes tied up late at night on the Great Unknown. You'll notice that all the canoes are tied together by a throw rope, and that throw rope is anchored to a pretty large tree. We stored them upright because in the event of a flash flood, they will float, not fill with water, and be held in place while we figure out what to do. And that's exactly what happened one night with Jesse. We were in a pretty big rainstorm from about 8 to 8:30. Pretty heavy rain for the most part, but it totally stopped around 8:30. We went to bed, and then at 3 a.m. we awoke to the shrieks of our students who were camped closer to the water. The river had risen maybe 20 or 30 horizontal feet, and their stuff was starting to get wet. Jesse and I ran down, started throwing their stuff away from the river. They were dragging their sleeping bags away, trying to move our boats away from the river. They hadn't floated away because they were tied up. We moved our camp further and further back, eventually got some sleep that night. But a couple of wild things happened as a consequence. The next day, we heard these massive splashes of the riverbank falling into the river as it was being eroded by this massive flood. And then as we were paddling the next day, it was all pretty safe for the most part. I said it was mostly class 1, some class 2, but this river was trucking, and we were doing 20 miles or so by lunch. So we had a lot of free time. I think we looked it up afterwards, and the river had been flowing around 2,000 CFS, and it peaked around 25,000 CFS during that storm. So that was a pretty wild experience. There is one canyon on the Great Unknown. This is called Mariscal Canyon. It's not as sheer as Santa Elena, but it is almost just as big, and it's really grand in its own right. It does have one crux rapid. This is kind of like a mini rock slide, like I showed earlier, with the same kind of challenges. If you look closely at the bank, there's really no way to portage it. There's no way to scout it. It's not hard paddling, but it's one that you should pay attention to. I paddled ahead and got out on a rock so I could direct our students where to go, because they weren't able to see the path through until they got up to it. Also, like the Boundary Waters, there's some human history. Here's some petroglyphs, evidence of the early native peoples. Some of the big groups were the Chisos, the Humanos, and the Comanche. Again, we could talk a lot about this on its own, but the the Big Bend area is rich, and again, not only natural history, but human history. There's lots of evidence of it. So if you are able to go on a trip down there, keep your eyes out for stuff like that. This section of the trip ends at a takeout called Rio Grande Village, and there's this hot spring right at the takeout that has been built up by a stone wall, and it's a pretty fantastic way to end a long paddling trip. It can be pretty hot out, but for some reason, a hot spring still feels good. Jump into the river to cool off. In the last section of the Rio Grande that I'm going to be glossing over is the lower canyons. This is kind of a shot of looking off into what you might be paddling off into if you paddle the lower canyons. I don't have a ton of information and images on this. I've only paddled it twice, but it's much more remote than the upper canyons in the Great Unknown. The whitewater is definitely more intense in a lot of ways. There's a few class 3 and class 4 rapids that are always there. And it's spectacular in its own right. It doesn't have, again, the sheer walls that Santa Elena Canyon has, but it's got massive canyons, these kind of strange purple mountains. They get this weird color in certain light, as you can see in this photo. It's pretty magical. This is a really horrible photo, but I had to throw it in. There's a hot springs on the lower canyons. It's deep in the canyon where it's filled with crystal clear water, very hot, but also filled with tiny little minnows that will actually nibble at you as you're soaking it. It's kind of it's an exciting experience. Here are a couple photos. They're not quite as crystal clear, but they're just to give you a little bit idea of the character of the lower canyons. Here's a shot of some students lining around the river cane hazard again. Not challenging to paddle, but if you're in the wrong spot and it's hard to stay away from it, you might get swept out of your boat. Not fun. The lower canyons highlight is this spot right here. It's called Burro Bluff. It's at a rapid called Lower Madison Falls. I'll show a photo of that in a minute, but this hike is about maybe an hour worth of hiking from the campsite on the river, and you're rewarded with such a sweet view. A couple photos of that. You can see a dry wash off to the left of the river that flows in flash flood times. And you can really see again just how crowded the riverbank is, just how lush that river cane is along much of it. It's a really interesting view from above to see this strip of green in this desert landscape. And here's a view of the Lower Madison Falls Rapid. It doesn't look like much from this high up, but it is a class 3, sometimes class 4 at high water rapid. It's one we actually never paddle with students because of the danger. And again, really just kind of thinking about this rapid, you can see how it would be really difficult to scout and or line again because of that river cane. The path that we usually take is to kind of line this section down here. If you can see my cursor, the right side, river right side of this first rapid, to this flat water area, and then to portage around this last bit. It can be paddled, and in the right circumstances and with the right paddlers and gear, I would go for it, but definitely one to exercise caution. Another shot of Lower Madison Falls. One final glamour shot of Burro Bluff. There's so many spectacular spots in the Big Bend area, and this is one of my favorites. And just a quick note as I start to conclude, this is the guidebook that is provided for the Big Bend area. There's one for this one, there's one for the Great Unknown, and there's one for the lower canyons, and they're really good guidebooks. They've got mile by mile maps with information, campsites, natural and physical hazards and highlights. They're really detailed. So if you end up going on a trip, these guidebooks are the key. So that's going to do it for my section. We're going to offer a little bit of time to ask some questions at this point, but I know that some people maybe have things to do and have maybe some Zoom fatigue. So if you are in that boat, feel free to log off, and thanks totally for coming. But Jesse and I would like to reserve a few minutes, maybe 10 or 15 at the most, to open it up for questions. And I'll just put one more plug in to join the Paddle Trails Club by going to paddletrails.org, and also to email Jesse and me at training@paddletrails.org if you've got any ideas of other presentations you'd like to see, or feedback on this one as well. So with that, I am going to open it up to some questions.
I have one question. First of all, great talks, great presentations. I don't know how long you worked on them, but they were really engaging, I thought. So Ollie, the river cane, is that an invasive plant or is that native?
You guessed it. It is invasive. Yep.
Figured, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly where it came from, but it's got out of hand pretty quick.
Ollie, I have a question, and I know the answer to it, but I think it'd be nice for you to talk about it. What are the border issues around Big Bend as opposed to the ones I talked about up on the Canadian border?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it's certainly in the news a little bit more than the Canadian border, and there is activity down there. There's a pretty big border patrol presence on the roads there, so that's something you'll see. You'll go through a couple of border patrol checkpoints as you're approaching, or mostly as you're leaving the Big Bend region. They're not so concerned with traffic entering it. But you are, technically speaking, also like in Minnesota, not supposed to camp on the Mexican side. It's pretty much convention among the paddling community down there that it's okay to do. And actually there is one exemption if it's ever safety based, if it has to do with some kind of safety, whether you're out late at night and there's a rescue or something like that, you can camp on the Mexican side. But it happens a lot where you're able to kind of camp. The better campsites are frequently on the Mexican side, but technically speaking, you're not supposed to do it.
I've got a couple of questions about some of the photos. I threw one in the chat as it went by, just as you were leaving the middle section, and there's that exit place where you're now hitting the Great Unknown. There's a great aerial shot that showed the end of the Santa Elena Canyon and then the open space. And like, was that something you climbed up to, or Jesse did, or was that just a stock photo you found? And then similarly, there's Burro Bluff that you hiked up to, but there's a couple of other aerial photos down there in the lower canyon. So I'm curious if those are places you can walk to, or you need an airplane or a drone for those pictures.
Yeah, that's a really good question. The one of the river leaving Santa Elena Canyon, that was an aerial shot, that is a stock photo. That I'm sure was probably taken from an airplane of some sort. The very first photo I showed was taken from a mesa on top of Santa Elena that was kind of showing a view out over the national park. Maybe I'll show it again if I have a second. But that shot, it would be really difficult to get. The ones of Burro Bluff were all actually photos I took, except for the last one that was kind of the vivid colors. That was a stock photo. But the ones of the rapid from above, those were ones I took from the Burro Bluff and the hike.
Thanks. Yeah, cool. That was a piece of there was some Ocotillo growing up on the top of the bluff. Did I see a little bit hanging out up there?
You got it. Yep. Yeah, Ocotillo aplenty. I see a question in the chat too about comparing river cane to tamarisk. And if I remember correctly, it's not the same, but there is also tamarisk down there, and it is also an invasive issue. We did see it down there as well, and it is a problem, but I do believe they're separate species. Maybe Ellie, if you remember, you could chime in. Yes, we got a chat from Ellie that says yes, different species, but also invasive. Mm-hmm. Maybe as we just see if there are any more questions percolate to the top here, I will, if we can bear through a little bit of internet lag, I'll see if I can share actually a couple snippets of video that I have. Let's see if I can make it work. And if you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to ask. I'll see if I can get it to work. All right, if you can see this, it might be a little grainy. Hopefully there's not too much lag, but this is a photo of Jesse and my students running a rapid on the upper canyons, a rapid we are camped next to called Dead Pop Rapid. They got a lot of water. Don't grab the gunnels. Did that go through? Can someone confirm that went through?
Yeah, that was good.
Okay, let me see. I've got a couple more snippets, and go ahead and ask any questions if anyone would like to. Here's a video just of me paddling. Ignore the stoic look. Jesse and I were doing a little artsy filming, just to kind of give you an idea of what it's like paddling on the flat water sections. And the last one I'll share is actually one I took from the internet. You'll notice that actually a lot of, if you do any Big Bend paddling searches on the internet, you'll notice that there were a lot of news stories written about it over the last 4 or so years as it was in the news more and more. And so this video is actually from a profile New Yorker magazine did. And I'll see if I can get that to play. And this will be the last one that I share. This video is from Boquillas Canyon, which is in the lower canyons at very low water. Amazing stuff you can do with the drone. And with that, I'll do one final call for questions.
Didn't see a lot of other groups in any of your pictures. Did you have to contend with other groups much?
No, not really at all. I think on my lower canyons trip, I saw maybe one group the entire time. And in my course of the upper canyons trip, there's definitely a handful of day trips we would see. And we'd share entrance camp, that campsite before Santa Elena Canyon, that kind of iconic canyon. We'd share that with a couple groups here and there. But for the most part, it's a very underused wilderness area.
And it was sort of late September, October-ish timeframe?
Yep. Yeah. Jesse and my trip was kind of late October, early November, which is a great time to paddle it. And yeah, you certainly get crowds around the holidays and around spring break and things like that. But yeah, almost any time that's not the summer is a good time to paddle it. Like I mentioned earlier, the water gets pretty low in the spring. So if I had to pick a time to paddle, I would say fall.
Go ahead.
We have a question. Can you hear us?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay, this is Dick Spencer. We paddled the Rio Grande probably 20 years ago. And there was a group of just 4 of us, Kathy and I and 2 other people. And we didn't see any canoes or any activity on the river. And no paddling at all, except for our group.
In April.
In April, we paddled it, so it was pretty hot. And it was so hot, we had to take a siesta every afternoon about 4. But my question is, there was an activity going on there where they were using a weed and boiling the weed to make candle wax.
It's brush.
Brush? And did you see any of that? It was an illegal activity, actually. So they kind of eyed us suspiciously.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. You're talking about the Candelia plant.
Yeah.
They would harvest that, and they would use brush and boil it to harvest this wax that is used. It's used in makeup. It's used in candy. It was pretty profitable. So in my time down there, that process had been completely ended. We saw no active processing of Candelia, but we saw a lot of old remnants of Candelia processing, old metal vats, pumping stations, things like that. You can definitely see the remnants of it, but no active processing in the last 5 years or so. Mm-hmm. I see one question in the chat. What year was this trip? It's a great question. We didn't even mention that. This was in, Jesse, if I remember correctly, 2016. Does that sound right?
Yep, 2016.
Well, guys, you have set the bar really high. Getting others to be willing to do sessions like this in the future. But I hope I've already lost a good bunch, but there's enough people on this call, Zoom still who have done some amazing expeditions in the past. And this is such a great way to get the paddling spirit out there and the travel lust and expedition itches going. So thanks so much. And all right, the rest of y'all. The gauntlet's been thrown down. They don't
It
need to be
is.
this
It is
good, but let's see
it's a
some
high
more
bar.
of these, please. It's like, what a great way to spend an evening.
In January,
rainy
yeah, thinking
January.
about summer trips.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, thanks a lot. That's a great call to action. Yeah, we would love for more people to do some of this. And, you know, if you want to do it like Jesse and I did, where you got a friend and you want to split it half and half, or if you've got enough material from your massive expedition, or even just a vacation where you took some day trips, we'd take it all. I totally
Yep.
agree. This is such a great way to live.
Not just canoe trips, but would love to investigate, you know, in this COVID age of doing some kind of training series of, you know, I'm not sure what these things might look like, but just throwing the idea out there that or the possibility out there that we might be offering some kind of training via Zoom as well. So if there's anything that people want to learn about, shoot them to training@paddletrails.org.
So Dave, if there are other people who have some nice shows like this to give, should we refer them to you
Nope, send them to Ollie and Jesse via training@paddletrails.org. I'll type it in the window, in the chat window here.
We're hoping to have some in-person classes this spring, but until then,
some live classes.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think with those parting words, I think that'll probably do it for us. So I'll just give one more thanks for you all to come out. Have a good night and happy paddling.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Great.